So this week's parsha, Parshas Chukas, famously begins with the subject of the mitzvah of the para aduma, for which reason the beginning of the parsha is also known as Parshas Para, which we read before chassidishe Nisan, which is its own thing. But that means there are two occasions during the year where it's apropos to talk about the para aduma, and this time we'll talk about it because it's the Parshas Shavua. So I'd like to focus here on an interesting nakud, an interesting idea, both interesting and practical, from the Likutei Torah for this week's parsha, which we actually find that in one of the Rebbe's letters, the Rebbe quoted it and invoked it in a very interesting, practical way, not specifically directly in the Avodas Hashem Dike context in the Likutei Torah, but as a sort of a principle that could be applied in life in different ways, as we shall see. True to our newfound commitment to find episode hakdama, but taka an inyan that's worthy of discussion from Yatzma and to be kovet at the beginning, I want to talk a little bit, probably much shorter hakdama, but just to share some of my thoughts about the whole topic of what's called in Chabad learning the chassidishe parsha, which refers to the Sfarim Torah or Likutei Torah, which themselves are really worthy of their own discussion, the background, the significance of these Sfarim. But obviously, in short, these are the Torahs of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe said many Torahs, especially beginning slowly in the mid Tafkuf Nuns, the mid 1790s, and there have been lists of Mamarim of those years that have been drawn up, primarily by Yosef Yitzchak Keller, who's a big scholar on these subjects and others. And I think even more recently, he released a list a bunch of years ago, and then a few years ago he issued a revised list because new manuscripts, new kisviyat show up. Those years are less clear. There weren't dedicated notebooks for each year. Later in Liadi, in the first decade of the 1800s, so you would have a notebook, a bichel of the Mamarim of this year, was very Masuda, very organized. But in the mid to late 1790s, the Alter Rebbe was starting to say them more often and more often, and you could see it growing from year to year. But it wasn't as Masuda yet. And we find in the Middle Rebbe that he had a cluster of Mamarim from one part of the year, and a cluster of Mamarim but it wasn't always clear which year. Are these the Mamarim of Tammuz of El, let's say, of Tafkuf Nun Zayin or Tafkuf Nun Ches? These types of questions, which are technically kind of technical questions that only directly interest a small number of people. But there are applications. There could be reasons why this could be interesting. At any rate, so it started slowly in the mid-1790s. I think maybe the first, I didn't look it up, but maybe the first mimer in the Likutei Torah that we have a date for is probably, I would say, Tafkuf Nun Dalet earliest, maybe Tafkuf Nun Hey. And presumably there probably isn't anything earlier than whatever can be pegged to that date, although there are some maybe that don't have a date at all. We know generally there's a big difference between the nature of the Torahs before Peterburg and after Peterburg, which Alter Rebbe was in Peterburg twice, and more specifically we mean before Liadi, after Liadi. Once the Alter Rebbe came to Liadi, so then there was a whole new Seder. A lot of things changed in the Alter Rebbe's Hanhaga and his relationship with the Chassidim, which is its own interesting topic. Rebbe Nuchem Greenwald has a chapter on it in his Sefer Harav that he put out a couple of years ago at this point. So these are all, we're touching on these in passing, but from then on, Alter Rebbe spoke very Masudar, and the Mamarim attained their final form. And then at that point, he had his brother, Yehuda Leib, known as the Maril, was sort of his official scribe, and he had a very strong connection with the Alter Rebbe in general, which is its own topic, which Rebbe Nuchem Greenwald has also written about in Heichel HaBesht, both in Yannei Halacha and in writing down these titles. So Maril was writing, and his Alter Rebbe's son, the Mittel Rebbe, was writing already from the Tafkuf Nuns we have from the Mittel Rebbe. And then at some point, Mittel Rebbe's brother Ramosha was also writing, and we have Bichlach from him as well. And then there are others, the later years at Tzemach Tzedek also, at the Einikel also started writing as well. And there were others other individuals who also wrote some hanachas, which is the term that we use. And then we fast forward, the Alter Rebbe passed away, and the way that Tzemach Tzedek writes about it later, it seems like no one had made a project out of collecting and having the full record of things the Alter Rebbe said. So the Bichlach existed, and the Mittler Rebbe surely made much use of them, wrote his longer Torahs based on the shorter Torahs of the Alter Rebbe, and he presumably Be'ikr used probably his own Bichlach of the Hanachas that he wrote. But let's say that what Maharil wrote, it doesn't sound like it was even necessarily preserved in one place, or the Maharil himself necessarily kept them. It would be interesting if this could be determined or figured out. But whatever the case is, the way that Tzemach Tzedek writes about it later is that he made it his personal project. And we know that Tzemach Tzedek, for whatever reason, considered himself a direct makabel from the Alter Rebbe, not through the Mittler Rebbe, and it also seems like he mostly avoided certainly the Mittler Rebbe's own Titus and Chiburim, but even the Mittler Rebbe's versions of how the Drushim, how the Titus were written down, he mostly avoided, and he was machshav be'ikr the Maharil, which was the official sanctioned transcription. So the Tzemach Tzedek made it his personal project to track down as many as possible to get the full collection. And he also went through all the Titus and was mitzayin from one to the next, and did his whole project of writing ha'aris, ha'goyis on the zedonos Torah. And then at some point, he had this idea, this notion that there should be an official collection of the Alter Rebbe's Titus, or the main Titus, the Alter Rebbe said in this format, in addition to the Sefer HaTanya, or whatever else of a different form. Once the Alter Rebbe passed away, they printed the Alter Rebbe's Igros as Igeres HaKodesh, the Teichendike Igros were printed as Igeres HaKodesh, and also there's the Kuntres Achron, and then the Igros that are after the Kuntres Achron. So there were other types of Titus and output for the Alter Rebbe, but this category of the Titus for Shabbosim, etc., that the Alter Rebbe said, like as we just explained, beginning in the 1790s and then Be'ikr from the first decade of the 1800s. So the Tzemach Tzedek made it his project to collect, and he wanted to issue this sefer, these volumes that would contain these mamarim. So first he printed Torah, which contained Bereshis and Shmois, which itself apparently was printed more than once. I don't know if I've ever seen this clearly myself, and I usually like to talk about what I've seen clearly myself, but it seems like the first time he printed it, he did not include any of his own ha'aras, his own hagahis, and then at some point it was reprinted, and there were a measure of his hagahis in it, but compared to look at the Torah, as we'll get to, Torah has much less. So it's really the Alter Rebbe's Titus with some hagahis of the Tzemach Tzedek. And then the second volume was printed under a different name, and it's explained that there were censorship issues, there were issues of printing chassidishe in the Russian Empire, as the battle over the future of the Jews in the Russian Empire escalated, with the government involved, the maskilim involved, so the censorship on the chassidishe forum, I believe, has escalated as well. They were seeking to ban it. I don't remember the exact details on how it applied and how they were able to print the Likutei Torah, if that was the issue, but it seems like they were able to print it, but apparently to make it easier, they had to use a different name. So the first chelik is called Torah, the second chelik is called Likutei Torah, which has V'yikra Midbar Dvarim and a whole section of Shir HaShirim, because the Alter Rebbe had a whole genre of Shir HaShirim Amarim, which is its own interesting thing. So the Tzemach Tzedek, in this case, included many more hagahis, to the extent that now, in hindsight, retroactively, in retrospect, the categories we would use today, it's been said that it's almost more accurate to describe them as a Tzemach Tzedek's memorim, almost more than the Alter Rebbe's memorim, in the sense that today we have sets of the Alter Rebbe's memorim in their original form, and then we have sets of the Tzemach Tzedek's writings, which a big portion of them are taking the Alter Rebbe's Titus and writing hagahis on them. So according to those categories, Likutei Torah is more in HaTorah territory than it is in Mamori Admor Hazaken territory. But obviously, at that time, in that context, it was still, of course, fundamentally the Alter Rebbe's Mamarim. But even for the loymid, the average loymids, Likutei Torah Maimer is much longer and has entire sections that are from the Tzemach Tzedek, and sometimes it's not even fully clear. A lot of loymdim don't fully understand and distinguish which l'chayra is a chasadim for the lemdim. There is some chassidishe streak of who knows, who cares, let's not distinguish. Malaga elter chassidim 150 years ago, 100 years ago, probably couldn't tell. But that doesn't seem like something in line with how the Rebbe would look at it. On the other hand, usually when you quote the Torah, you say the Alter Rebbe says, look at the Torah. I sometimes get nervous when people do it because I want to take a look. 1 second, is that paragraph from the Alter Rebbe? Is it from the Tzemach Tzedek? If it's Tzemach Tzedek, then why are you saying it b'shem the Alter Rebbe? I don't know, that bothers me a little bit. I don't know if when the Rebbe spoke, if there was ever an opportunity to prove one way or the other if the Rebbe was medayek or not. There are, like I said, some places where it's clear that's the Tzemach Tzedek, some places it's not immediately obvious, but those who have developed the sense, first of all, there could be kisvei manuscripts that could be checked and compared, but even without that, if you develop a sense for the rhythms of the different styles, it's quite possible to distinguish fairly accurately, fairly consistently. There may be a line or a word here and there where it gets a little harder. The Tzemach Tzedek did all kinds of editing as well. It's not that was part of his project, was editing, and sometimes editing meant that he saw words or a line that he thought were inaccurate and he had to fix it, or weren't clear and he had to fix it. But sometimes the editing goes further than that, and sometimes he merges stuff or cuts stuff up, and that itself is its own fascinating topic, very invisible to most people, but those who spend a lot of time with it are more cognizant, more aware that there's stuff like this going on. So that would be the overview, bekitzer, to understand the Torah. And for many years, putting Mittel Rebbe's farm aside, it came to be seen as the main Sifrei Chabad are Sifrei Tanya and Torah. Those are the main mamarim of the Alter Rebbe Bechlal, and therefore everything that comes afterwards is sort of like footnotes, just like Lahavdil, the Welt says, footnotes to Plato. So in Chabad, everything is footnotes to the Alter Rebbe, and everything the Rebbeim say afterwards is based on previous memoirs, which ultimately go back usually to the Alter Rebbe, or certainly the ideas. So Mela, these are the foundational texts of Chabad. Now, there's this idea that this is called the chassidishe parsha, and so the Rebbe I'm not here to trace the exact origins of the idea, but in the Rebbe's talks and the Rebbe's writings, there was this very strong notion that the Bechlal, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe copied in Hayom Yom said that the Alter Rebbe said that mit der Zeit, so one's learning and one's thoughts throughout the week should be parsha themed, or maybe even more granularly, if you break up the Chumash, lefi the Seder of Chitas, you Rishon on Yom Rishon and Sheni on Yom Sheni. So maybe even you're thinking specifically about that chelik of the parsha for that day. So that should shape the rhythms of one's life and of one's learning and one's thoughts. So that also extends to the idea that every week one should learn the chassidishe parsha. Everyone of Chabad, I would think, is aware of this basic point, that's the ideal. Now the shaila is, what I wanted to talk about, what I had in mind, al takdama, was to talk a bit honestly about this issue, this nakuda, which is, the question is, what percentage of people today, of Anash, are actually learning the entire chassidishe parsha, let's say. But part of it, as the Rebbe would convey, is that you have to be mashlim Torah every year. So that includes Shir Shirim as well. So you have to figure out where to fit the Shir Shirim in, the weeks where it's shorter, so that you can do more Shir Shirim. So decide the idea of finishing it in the week, but then it's also the finishing it in the year. And the Rebbe mentioned it many times throughout the years. Recently, I was reminded that the Mashpir Mechol Galam has a sefer, an old sefer from maybe at this point 30 years ago, Shari Limbit HaChassidus, where he was malakir, all the references, all the heroes about learning Chassidus, how to learn, what to learn. So surely he has something on this over there as well. It's malakir a lot, although it's probably never fully comprehensive. Meaning there are probably Makairis that if you were to update the Sefer, redo the Sefer, we would probably have found more Makairis by now, and there are also things that are constantly being printed that were never printed before, letters of the Rebbe and minus of the Rebbe, but it still gives you a snapshot, and so it certainly was a very serious thing. The Rebbe was murdered many times about the importance of this. But so the question is, how many people are finishing the Torah every year? And how many people are finishing the Parsha each week, and how many people are even starting it each week. So I don't know what the numbers are, but from my winkle in Chabad, it's hard to say that the numbers are too high. I think part of the issue from my perspective is that even those, let's say, I think there are a lot of chassidishe yungalite that can mean up to age 50. Shabbos, they sit down, maybe they don't get up too early, maybe they actually sit down at 10, 11 o'clock, which is its own issue. They sit down at 10, 11, 12 o'clock, and then they open early, the Torah, and then they sit and they learn it for an hour, and then they daven. Could be that there's a certain percentage of people like that. First of all, they're not finishing it if they're doing it that way. But also the shaila is, what do people have to show for it? So now there's also this issue, which maybe I've touched on before, I wanted to touch on, which is there's this issue in Chabad, this topic, this matter, this noise of doing things b'kabbalas oil. There's a lot, it's conveyed very strongly in yeshiva, that there's a lot of stuff that we do b'kabbalas oil. So if you were a true chassid, if you had true kabbalas oil, so maybe you would do the chitas and the Rambam and the chassidishe parsha and whatever else maybe belongs on that list, or your own eigene Sachen. And why would you be doing it? Because you are a good bacher, a good chassid, and you have the requisite kabbalas oil. That would sort of be what it would come down to. And very few people have the kabbalas oil, especially after yeshiva. So you want to say the opposite of kabbalas oil is efkedus, prikus oil, so we have a rampant problem, so no one has the right amount of kabbalas oil. If only we had more kabbalas oil, then we would be doing it. That seems to be the very dominant emphasis when it comes to all of these things where it seems like it's difficult, it seems like it's challenging, it's hard to, it's not something you could just do, even chitas, easier to, even if you don't consider yourself a big learner or a big chassid, or you keep all the hayras, but chitas is easy to do for most. Rambam to some extent, usually 3 prakim is considered more advanced, but 1 parak, sefer mitzvahs, it's easy to also sort of knock it off, check it off your list, but the line is certainly drawn by Torah. It's not something that could just happen. There's also no official chalukah. So it's not like there's the day's material that you have to cover. It's just sort of the week's general material. I think a few years ago someone made a chalukah that's shaloi lefi the week in the year, but maybe to finish it in a few years. And the premise was, look, if at least people will do this, at least they'll finish it every few years. And then it gets pushed back from the more chassidishe, kabbalas oil chevra, that's not the hira, that's not what the Rebbe wanted. Okay. But what's the mitzias? The mitzias is I don't know what percentage. I don't want. I'm afraid to suggest a number because it's not gonna be so nice to offer the number of again which people are finishing the sefer, which people are finishing at least are striving or often finish the week's mamarim, and how many are really starting it. That number should seemingly be a little bigger. Many shuls have a shir officially before davening, 9:30. Question is, how many people come? What percentage of the mispalim come and attend that shir? These are all inside questions that we have to think about seriously. It's sort of the parallel, the counterpart to what happened to Chazer and Maimer, Shabbos afternoon, Shalosh Shudas, which has also been that institution has been tremendously weakened, I think, if we speak about in terms of broad numbers, how many shuls are doing it, and then beyond how many shuls are doing it, how many people from the shul are showing up, or staying, remaining, or sitting and listening, as opposed to sitting and talking. So these are the 2 major institutions, chassidishe institutions, you could say, that are both pretty strongly weakened. The Shalshudas Maimer and the Torah, specifically in its Shabbos morning shir format. Which if you're scheduling for Shabbos morning, then there's no chance of finishing unless it's maybe a few parshas that only have 1 Maimer where it's shaykh to finish. But that's not the norm. That's not the rule. So usually, for most, if they are showing up, so then maybe the goal is to finish 1 Maimer. That also depends on how long the Maimer is. Maybe to finish an ois, to finish 2 oisios, to finish a page. I'm just saying the mitzias. I don't know if anybody has actually addressed the mitzias head on and spoken about it like this, but I think it should be spoken about in some format, in some venues. So I'm taking the liberty of doing so now. So like I said, there's this this framing of Kabbalah oil. If only we had more Kabbalah oil. But the question is, and this is a larger question, I think, about how things are taught and how things are promoted and conveyed. Kabbalah oil is good, nothing against it, but does it seem to be working? Can Kabbalah oil carry so many people so far? And there's also the question of, is that really the point? Was that what the Alter Rebbe started Chabad for, to give us a checklist of 20 extra things? If you're not Chabad, if you weren't Megala, the chassidishe, so then you would have your regular Jewish checklist of things to do by Kabbalah soil. Now the Alter Rebbe came along and parsha gave us another 20 things to do that fill another 20, 30, 40 hours a week of stuff to do, to check off. And if you do these things, if you check these things off, so then, I don't know if we can promise Elam Haba, because that's not our style, it's not our sprach, so what do you get for it? Then you know that you're a good chassid, that you're makusher. It doesn't seem like that's the pshat. And I'm sure if you go through the Rebbe's talks, I'm sure Kabbalah oil plays a role, but that's not, I don't think that's the main message, the main theme. The reason why the Alter Rebbe came along was to be malhiv the hearts of Yidden to Avodas Hashem, and he said these Torahs to be malhiv Yidden to Avodas Hashem. The earlier Torahs taka were less of the whole structure and more of the point, the message, and then later in Liadi they attained the whole structure. It's a whole drush, but the question, a few questions at the beginning, in the middle, and an end. But the goal was to, like I said, to be malhev the Yiddish herzer to Avodas Hashem. Interestingly, I've observed that the Alter Rebbe in the beginning didn't seem to regard his own output as a chelik b'Torah, because whenever he would talk about learning nigla versus learning something else, learning pnimius, so he would mention Zohar, he would mention other things, which is its own interesting evolution of Zohar and Chabad in the earlier Doros versus later Doros, and the attitude towards chassidishe Chabad as a limud. So the Tzemach Tzedek printing Torah, because the Torah itself contributed to it being seen as a limud, and at some point replaced learning Zohar and stuff like that, where you could just learn the Torah, look at the Torah itself. But the things that you're learning, if you're learning Zohar, you're learning these inyanim, it's because of the role it plays in your Avodas Hashem. For the Chassidim are people who take their Avodas Hashem seriously, and their Avodas Hashem specifically in the mold, the tradition of the Zohar, the Arizal, the Baal Shem Tov, Alter Rebbe, and following those ideas, those precepts, and learning chassidishe is part of that picture. So if there's some person who is matzliach somehow to learn the entire chassidishe parsha every week, and it's in ganzen b'Kabbalas oil, and then what does that mean? That means that after, let's say they finished it, let's say they broke it up throughout the whole week, and I don't know how many people that is, but let's say, and they get to the end of the week, but they don't have anything to show for it in their Avodas Hashem, or let's reduce the bar. Never mind Avodas Hashem. What about what they're thinking about, what they're excited about? Do they have something that they are excited to share? And if you don't have that to show for it, so then it's very hard for me to understand what we're even doing here. Like I said, there is this very strong predominant sense that it's about checking boxes on a checklist, and I'm sure there are people out there that will already be upset by whatever I already said, but I think what I'm saying, obviously, I think is more correct and more in acknowledgement of the emes of the Metzias. Interestingly, I know one chassidishe Baal Bas grade. He has a regular, I can't call it a day job, but he has his own parnasa, he has his own business. Technically no official shtela, no official shlichus, although he's Isaac Mivtzoyim as well. I'm not going to say his name, obviously. But and I don't know if any of the people listening are people who run in his circle. But there is someone I know. I've gotten to know him a little bit from the WhatsApp groups that I'm on already for many years. One of the first groups I joined, when I joined, whatever it is, 10 years ago. So he's a very chassidishe Baal Bas, and he doesn't participate so much in the time-wasting conversations. Usually when he writes something, it's mishtatev, it's usually more teichendik. And it seems like, I didn't confirm 100%, but it seems like he is makbid to finish the chassidishe parsha every week. He has that start guide. But what I've noticed about him is that every week, or almost every week, he'll share on that chat, he'll share starke shtiklach that he comes across. He'll say, wow, here's a starke shtickle that I came across in the chassidishe parsha this week. And every time he shares them, when I look at it, it actually fits my definition as well of what I would consider to be a good shtickle, a geschmack shtickle. So I wanted to get to this point of part of the thing is, we'll get to it, of what percentage of Torah just feels like you're reading through Zohar, it's a slog, versus the exciting part. So it's interesting that he seems to have a knack for singling out the interesting lashonos, the starke lashonos, stuff that's worth cropping, quoting, and singling out, and saying, "Wow, this is a starke shtickle." And many of them are not well known, not famous. Maybe I haven't paid attention. Maybe he's replicated it, chosen the same shtickle a few times over the years. I don't remember. But I've noticed it over years, and even in the last few months, I've seen he's singled out shtiklach, and they're taka very good. Meaning, if I were to do the same project myself, I would likely single out those shtiklach. And I've always said that I respect that. I have tremendous respect for where I see he's taka has the Kabbalah's oil or whatever to do the hira, but he actually has what to show for it. In real life, in real conversation, in this case, virtual conversation, he's saying, look, Chaver, look at this kata, this shtickle that I came across. What a gewaldige shtickle, what a geschmack shtickle. He also listens to Sichos of the Rebbe. He shares, does the same thing with audio of the Rebbe. He'll share 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and say, listen to this, it's amazing. So he does that with that as well. That's when he's driving in the car, he listens to that. So that's obviously, I can't vouch. I don't know him really in person. I don't know if I ever met him in real life, but at least this side of him that I have seen, that's a real chassidishe balabas, and in the basic sense of meeting these minimum requirements. So seeing that has sharpened for me this distinction, or this notion of what the correct way versus the incorrect way. So as I started touching on, part of the issue, I think, is that often these long drushim l'kutei Torah, they start off with a few questions, and the way you're taught to learn in yeshiva, so you learn it, you're reading it slowly, and you're trying to understand. And if you consider yourself a gründlich learner, so you have to make sure you understand the question. But at that rate, just do the math. How much time does it take you per line? How much time does it take you per column? Because the pages are divided into 2 columns each on each side, so 4 columns per page, per 2 sides of the page. So do the math, and then at that rate, how much are you going to actually finish at that rate? Also, speaking as a regular grub human being, not everything is equally interesting to everybody. Often people just start from the first one, and maybe in a week where there's 3 or 5 or 7 or 10, maybe the 4th one or the 7th one or the 9th one is more interesting, more exciting. So this is the challenge, and I remember this really going back to many years ago. You open the chassidishe parsha, and lav dafka it gets off to an exciting start. You have a marim where there's 3 oises, 4, 5, 6, and the Torah with hagais. So each ois is a column and a half. And big chunks of it could just be tzionim of the tzemach tzedek, or aris of the tzemach tzedek. So maybe you skip them, maybe you don't. People are getting bogged down in it. It's very clear that people are getting bogged down in this stuff. So an eitzah of how to be mimala, the hira and the ratzin, exactly as the Rebbe said it, still remains a desideratum, as they say in the academic world, something that still needs to be done and figured out. But I think at the very least, to try to, if you're not going to finish it anyway, let's put it that way. If you're not going to finish it anyway, but you want to at least do something, because now the shaila is, what's the best use of your time? Is it kedai to start from the beginning and just see how far you get? Or maybe what we need is, there should at least be a list for every parsha of what the starke, geschmacke, or famous ketoim are from that week's parsha. And that does not seem to be something that has been done yet. So this is something that I've always sort of had in my mind as something that's kedai to do. So let's say here, I'm not going to record, am I going to start recording a weekly shir on the whole Torah? I don't, unless someone wants to make that a reality, maybe we can make it a reality, but stamas, I don't see that happening in this format. But something that we could do, and I think we should do, is that we should try to locate, isolate, find the geschmack shtiklach, and if that means not starting from the beginning, but maybe getting a summary, a kitzer of the beginning, the framework of the Maimer, to understand what the context is, and then to say, look, if you're going to spend only 45 minutes this week, Shabbos morning or whatever, on it, so read this shtickle, read that shtickle. Maybe if I cared, maybe people knew where the geschmack shtiklach were, that would give them more of a cheshik and a chayas, that they would learn more during the week, because they know what their goal is of what they're looking out for, as opposed to the current state of things where there's just this big huge block of text, and okay, so I'll start Shabbos morning and we'll see how far I get. Those are my thoughts on this matter. Not so directly connected, but it's interesting. I just saw, I'll mention it because it's mamish fresh. They just printed this tzura being printed all the time with new chagos of the Rebbe. So they just printed the Pesach Dover to the Maimer Benocha Olav Ruach Havaya. It's originally from Tafshin Yadalet, I think it was printed for Tafshin Memches. And so they put the whole Maimer together. The Rebbe was Magir, they printed it. But it was just revealed that on the Pesach Dover, at the bottom, it's signed Mareches Oitzer Chassidim. So the Rebbe commented on the word Mareches and wrote a very sharp line there. He says, Mareches, what's the Mareches? Mareches' job is to make sure that, I have to go look at it again to make sure I'm not misreading it, misremembering it. It sounds like the Rebbe uses a lashon that should be Kishulchan Aruch, I think. So it's like the lashon is there that it should be Kishulchan Aruch la'achila. The Rebbe uses the acronym for Shulchan Aruch, like when you use the acronym, you think of the Sefer Shulchan Aruch. But there's also the phrase, a Shulchan that is Aruch la'achila. So the Rebbe wrote, Kaf, Shin, Bav, Ayin, la'achila. So Mustama, there was Mecham Iker, not to the Sefer, but to the phrase. And he just used the acronym for the Sefer for the phrase, Kishulchan Aruch la'achila. So, and the Rebbe continued to write in Hebrew, but it's like almost like a translation in Yiddish. In Yiddish, sometimes you say "Viest mendas." So the Rebbe said, "Mareches' job it should be Kishulchan Aruch la'achila." So, does Mareches think that the olam has what to eat and what to digest and what to take away from this? Very, very sharp of art. So I don't know what Amal back in the day when I was growing up. This was what everyone was afraid of. They said this is why you're now to print Hagos, because it's going to be Mo'er Shilas. But Lamaisa, these things are being printed. Lamaisa, there's a Hayra and Avodas Hashem for everything, and so it makes me think, makes me wonder if the Rebbe himself is raising questions about some of these Mamorim Mugahim. I wonder sometimes if are these things taka if people have a very limited amount of time, they're going to learn one mimer a week. Is this the best use of their time? Is this the mimer they should be learning? Shaita, this was a way for Chassidim to connect to the Rebbe. So when it was printed, so Stam, everyone learned it immediately, and that was a way people felt the Rebbe was giving them Amar, especially once the Rebbe stopped saying Amarim, so the Rebbe was issuing Amarim. B'ksab, b'kundish, so this was when it's mamish, fresh, versteh. But it seems like the Rebbe is being ma'ir a little bit about this, the style of these Mamorim Mugahim. This is B'derech Efshar, obviously. It's a bit questionable to raise this question, to raise this point. But those were my thoughts. And again, Hayos was just printed yesterday, or Mamish in the Let's the Tag. So I thought I would mention it, that the Rebbe is also seemingly raising a similar related question as to what is the readership going to take from it. So I think that the Rebbe ultimately would want that we should, if people are learning, they should maximize what they're able to take from it and apply to themselves. And we have to also make that more possible for people. And I think one way of perhaps doing that is, let's say in the context of Torah, is to identify the starke shtiklach, the interesting shtiklach, things that people can enjoy and apply to themselves and have a takeaway and have something to talk about that they would be interested in sharing and repeating with others. So those are that's the line hakdama. And now please don't jump ship. Please try sticking around just a bit more if you got this far. Let's see how we do with this actual topic. So I'll start with the letter of the Rebbe. How did I get to this shtickle? I got to the shtickle from a letter of the Rebbe, which I came across last week because the date of this letter is Chavav Sivan. Last week, Chavav Sivan, I don't always record the results of my searches, but I was searching for Igros of Chavav Sivan. I came across this, a letter from the Rebbe. This is a letter from the Rebbe in Igris Kodesh Chelek Tezvav, which is the year Tafshin Yud Zayin. And this is letter number 5546. And you could tell this is one of the many letters there where the name of the recipient is omitted and other things are omitted. And we'll get to that a bit later. But it's about that someone, one of the Rebbe's chassidim, shluchim, is having some kind of issue or something with a local rav. And in that context, the Rebbe is mitzayin to the Likutei Torah of that week. So when I saw it last week, it wasn't the Likutei Torah of last week. But so it was either doing it for the date or doing it for the parsha. So we'll do it for the parsha. The Rebbe is mitzayin to Likutei Torah, parshas chukas. This is so let's look at the letter. So the letter is Chaf of Siman Tafshin Zayin, Brooklyn Shalom Ubracha, and then it says regarding what you wrote about the rabbi ... So they omitted who it was because do we want to print an igris that this chassid, the shliach, had an issue with his rav, so they omitted the name of the recipient and the name of the rav. So there's some matter with this rav, as we'll see. The matter seems to be that they're not in the same wavelength, not the same style, that kind of complaint seemingly. So the Rebbe says, Gam al kegoin da, for this as well, koi hamavur b'likutei Torah d'shavuah. So what it says, Likutei Torah for this week, chukas, applies to this case as well. What does it say there? Asher af tzura ein mas'ima, even if the tzura doesn't fit, isn't a good fit, yesh lenatzal hakoach sheba hatzura ba'ofen haratzoi ukechol ha'afshari. But we should still take advantage of the koach, the energy, in the tzura, in the correct way and as much as possible. So that's the very, not very particularly clear. It's clearly written to someone who's meant to get the reference. So it's his reference about the tzura. Even if the tzura is not good, but you should use the koach in the tzura. So therefore you should use, it continues this, therefore you should take advantage, use his tchunas nafshay, his personality, his characteristics, and often to increase hafatas hamayanas, which means hanhagas, hadrachas of Torah chassidus and learning Torah chassidus. And the way you describe him, it shouldn't be too difficult if you approach it in a nice way. If it's b'darkei noyam, vidal. Vidal is always like an exclamation mark to end a paragraph. So the Rebbe seems to be saying, if you go about it the right way, even if there's something that's not fitting, tzura ein mas'ima. But if you utilize the koach and you utilize his traits and you approach it with b'darkei noyam, then it should work. Now I actually found already last week. I found the letter in full without the hashmatas, and l'shleimus inyan. I'll get to it later, but we'll save that for the end. Let's not get off topic. Let's remain focused for now on this topic. This vort that the Rebbe is saying. So what does tzura even mean here? And so. Let's jump to the Likutei Torah. The Likutei Torah, it's referring to the first mimer in the Likutei Torah chukas. Vayidaber chulu zois chukas chulu. And it happens to be, I actually went and checked, was it a parshas para mimer, was it a chukas mimer? It was actually a chukas mimer, because sometimes the tzemach tzedek could take a parshas para mimer originally and put it in a chukas, or vice versa. It's part of the things, part of what the tzemach tzedek might do. But this is taka for chukas. So the mimer is teaching the inyan of para aduma in avodas Hashem, beruchnis and avodas Hashem. And among other things, it talks about sreifas hapara. A big part of the process is burning the para aduma. So I'm going to now go and lay out the what the Rebbe was referring to. Now, I'll just mention that I'm not 100% sure. Maybe this is something that is very well known, and I'm chazering it like it's a chiddush, a chiddush tekazach. Sometimes I get feedback from some of the listeners who are big chachamim, and I mean it not ironically. I mean it ernst, big chachamim, and they say, "Oh, this thing that you said is not a chiddush, and that's not a chiddush." I said, "Okay, I think to you, you're the outlier. Maybe you thought about X, Y, and Z, but." I'm usually more confident in knowing whether something is well known or not well known. Meaning I'm able to represent and place myself in the shoes of the average person as well. I try to. But in this case, I'm not 100% sure. I have sometimes what they call a chorba haskala, where there's something that many people know, and punkt, I don't know it. So I don't know if the following is relatively well known. because it seems like it has the potential. It's the first mimer in Kutei Torah. Usually the first mimer is more well known, but it's in the second ice, so maybe some people don't get as far as the second ice. I don't know. It's not something that I looked at and said, this is the famous Kutei Torah about whatever. It is certainly quoted a nice deal in later sources as well, but still, I don't know. I never noticed that it's a famous ach, so we're going to talk about it like it's a shtickle and b'chudishtik. Let's pay attention. Let's look up this inyan, this kashmaka inyan, which I think certainly is worth dwelling on, focusing on, and bringing it into sharper relief. So in the first ice of this mimer, among other things, somewhere in the middle, Alter Rebbe says, V'nei mitzvahs para aduma, generally is about ratzay and shoiv. Ratzay and shoiv are, of course, a big theme, particularly in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe. And in that model, so burning the para, taking the cow, the heifer, burning it to ashes, that's the ratzay, which fits with the imagery of ratzay, of sort of wanting to leave one's restrictions. So here you're literally burning the para. So that's ratzay. And the shoiv is taking whatever remains of it, v'nas and olav, mayim chayim al kelis, you're putting it in a keli and you're pouring water on it. So that seems to be doing something with it. So in terms of the imagery, that's more of a shoiv-like activity. And obviously that's going to translate into the ruchnius and the avodas Hashem. And then Ois Beis comes to focus, so that's the middle voice. Ois Beis comes and directly focuses on this. And it begins and it says, so now we have to understand, Taka, what's Pshat, Srefa Sapara, and that's Ratzai. So he begins by quoting a Zohar, and maybe I've said before, I'll say it again, that the Zohar layer in Chassidus Chabad, especially by the Alter Rebbe, was a very important layer. Like I said back then, the Iker Limud was in Zohar, and the Chassidim at that time, the Velt, the Olam at that time was more Baki in Zohar, and if you wanted to prove within that world that you're serious, so you had to quote Zayars and Taich Zayars and prove that you have a good Taich, a better Taich than Zayar. And that itself is a big element, even in Tanya as well. Yeah, towards the end of the first chelik of Tanya, there's like a whole sequence, a whole section where the Alter Rebbe says, and now I'm going to tell you the real Taich in the Maimer HaYenuka in Zayar, which sure, there's the message that Alter Rebbe wants to relay, but the way I read it, a big part of it was, like, I'm going to tell you a Gavaldik Pshat in a Maimer HaZayar, whereas today I think that's sort of lost on most people, and I think in the standard oifen of learning, the Zayars sort of almost get filtered out. They almost fade into the background. He quotes a Zayar, and this is going to be the Yisrael, and it's a Zayar Chukas. The Zayar says, Para de Kabilas min Smala, the para, the cow, the heifer receives from the left. And what's on the left? So in the Merkava, Lamaila, you have the Pnei Ari, the Pnei Shor. What's on the left? The Pnei Shor. So the Pnei Shor, Lamaila, is the smoil, and the para down here receives from the smoil. Now, the Rebbe says, we know that when we use terms like Yamin and smoil is Deicha, Yamin Mekareves. And he goes on to explain that this is the model that Yamin, being Mashpia B'Yamin, that's the Ashpa of Kedusha, being Mashpia B'Smoil, that's the Ashpa of Klippa, Ayin Sham. Here, for example, being Mekatzer, because it's not directly to the thing we want to focus on. So the Alter Rebbe says, so that's the inyan of Para de Kabilas Mismola. So it starts off as Pnei Shor Lamailo, but then through this whole channel of Smoil, at some point it turns into Ashpa Saklipus, and that's what the Para seems to represent down here. And Para Aduma is to address that. So you have the Para represents the problem of Smoil, the problem of the Ashpa Saklipus in this world. And Para Aduma is meant to counteract what do you do when you have the problem of Para? So you fix it with the means of Para Aduma. So he says, first you have the step of Sheva HaZoyos, you spray 7 times in the direction of the oil moed, which is also, that's already right by the Srefa. There's already, usually we think of the Hazav, the Para Aduma later when the Tmei Meis, but really part of the original Seder is this Sheva HaZoyos Nechech Pnei Oil Moed. So that already, on the spot, that is to take the para. So you start off with the para is bad. You burned it, and then you spray it. That's being maila, the pneumius of the para. So you're identifying that on the outside it was not so good, but on the inside there's a pneumius that's toiv, and that fits with the fact that originally it comes from Pnei Shor Shem Merkava, which is also good, but something got wrong, something went wrong in the process that led from Pnei Shor down to the para. So what we're doing here is we're taking the para and we're reducing it and returning it just to its good essence, and that represents its original source in the Pnei Shor, and we're taking that and we're reconnecting it with its source to bring it back to what it originally was. So that's how he says it. But then here's where he gets into the idea of burning the para, the terminology and the imagery of burning and ashes. So the Rebbe says, then, so I didn't look up the Seder, I don't have the Seder, Siyas para aduma clear in my head. He's saying after the Sheva HaZoyos is the Seder Sapara. Maybe it's Sheva HaZoyos from the previous. I didn't go look it up. Please excuse me. I apologize. But so whatever the order is, so let's say that's the next step, is to burn it to make it Efer. What's Pshat? The burning, making it into Efer. Especially in L'chayr, we just said, you're being mile of the Pneumius. So this is the Pshat. He says, Aderech Mashal, when you burn wood, you start off with wood, and then after the burning process, all you're left with is ashes. So what are these? How would we describe what's left? The Rebbe says what remains, the ashes, that's actually the true essence, the true core of the wood. Because really, the core of everything is offer. He's using the terminology of the Daled Yesodus, which famously, in the Jewish world, famously is expressed by the Rambam right in the beginning of Yesodei HaTorah. So you have the Daled Yesodus, but the true Yesod, certainly down here, is offer. But the other three, the Eish, Ruach, and Mayim, get mixed in, get blended into it. That's how the Rambam there explains that's sort of the physics of every object, everything, that it's just differing mixtures of these four elements. So you're taking, the Rebbe says, you're taking the offer, which is Hatzmusai, and you mix and you blend the other three in. You take the fire, you burn it with fire, so then the three Yesodus, Eish, Mayim, Ruach, those extra three, they dissipate, they disappear through the smoke. And the fourth Yesod, that's Musay, the offer, that remains, and that's the Efer. Maybe Taka, maybe Al Pizet Taka, I don't remember now, maybe it's the Taka even in this parsha, where you see that the word offer is used where it seems to mean Efer. So maybe that also ties into that the offer is Efer, the Efer is offer. So that's, and I was going to make a note to mention later, the Alter Rebbe actually uses this framework in Tanya in Igeres HaKodesh somewhere as well, but nothing to do with this topic at hand, but this description of the process of burning appears elsewhere in the Alter Rebbe's Torah as well. But what's he doing with this idea here? So in addition to the Daled Yesodus framework, now the Alter Rebbe also introduces and uses the Chomer Tzura framework, which is also used by the Rambam in the same Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. And there's this idea of the Chomer and the Tzura, that you have the matter, and then there's the shape, the matter, the form the matter attains. And there seem to be many dargas and layers to this. So in the context of Daled Yesodus, so the Yesodus themselves are the Chomer, but then when they blend, so they appear in a certain tzura. But then seemingly there are additional dargas. Let's say you take the wood itself could be the Chomer, and then if you make a bench out of it, so then that attains the tzura of a bench. So this was also terminology and a framework that was used in ancient times to sort of bring clarity in many cases, many discussions, so you can distinguish. Are we talking about the Chomer here? We're talking about the tzura. So the Alter Rebbe is also using it here and ties it into the point he just made, the point we just made about burning it and reducing it to the offer from the blend of Yesodus also corresponds to the idea of Chomer versus tzura. Everything is comprised of Chomer and tzura. So in this case, if we're saying that there's an atzmos of the wood, which is the offer, so that would be the Chomer. The offer is the Chomer. And then the additional, adding the three Yesodus, that would be the tzura of the wood. So that means that by burning the wood and ridding it of the other three Yesodus, what you're doing is you're ridding it of its tzura, and you're reducing it to its pure Chomer. So that's in, like I said, the terminology, the imagery of burning. And that's what we're doing here with the Parah Aduma. But what does that mean in Avodas Hashem? It's the same thing, or a similar thing. In the Nimshal, the para is the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, which is obviously also a major theme in the Alter Rebbe's Torah, Torah's Chabad. So your cow, your inner cow, you have to use the nefesh habahamis, and it also comes from pnei shor, same process, and it's like the para, the kavilas mismoila, that lashon hazayir would apply to nefesh habahamis as well. And just as there's three dargas here. There's sort of the mashal mamish, and then there's the ruchnias lamaila that we're saying the para represents the hashpah of klippus lamaila, and then there's the third, which is in avodas Hashem. So just as we said that in ruchnias in general, from para is associated with shacha the hashpah techitzainim. So in avodas Hashem individually, that would be the nefesh habahamis. So your nefesh habahamis itself is just a nefesh habahamis, but then there's the hashpah l'chitzainim. What's the hashpah l'chitzainim? That the nefesh habahamis is drawn, is attracted to tanuga elam hazeh, whether those are beheter or whether those are beisser. So that's the hashpah l'chitzainim, to use that terminology, that would apply to one's nefesh habahamis. Okay, so what do we do about that? What are we doing with that? So the Alter Rebbe adds another point. The Alter Rebbe says when a person desires something gashmistic, so terminology we could use to describe that is that item, the object of his desire, is a kli, is a vessel to the desire on his end. So whether it's the object itself, or even the thoughts, the oisius of the thoughts and the speech that one thinks or speaks in relation to that object, are also a form of kalim, and certainly the ma'aseh that one does to achieve it or to enjoy it, those are all kalim to the raw, pure ratzain of the nefesh habahamis. So all of those things he's calling them kalim, and all of those would also count as tzura to the chaymer. The chaymer is just the raw ratzin. That's like the chaymer apashat. And then these things, v'heim heim hatzura, li yisrei tzakach v'kach. So in this nimshal, they would be the tzura. Zok the Alter Rebbe. This distinction between chaymer and tzura can help us clarify, when we talk in this context about ra, that something is ra, what exactly is ra and what exactly is not ra. So this ratzin, so we just distinguish between the ratzin, which is its own thing, and then, which we just call the chaymer, and then there's the kalim. He says, even though the ratzin, when it takes the form of a taiva ra, the ratzin could also be described as ra gamur, but we can't call this koach. So in the Rebbe's Igaris, you can use the koach versus tzura. The koach itself, the koach, the etzem haratzin, the koach is not fundamentally evil mitzad etzem atzmusay. He says its etzem is just to desire. Desiring you could desire anything. You could desire good things also, just as now a person desires bad, they could also desire good. So the capacity to desire can't be described as inherently evil. What's evil is that you took this capacity, you took this koach, the koach hamisave, and you channeled it for ra. So the tzura, so this distinction is helpful. The tzura became very ra, and it's in these terrible levushim until a person is drawn to stray from a mitzvah say or to desire an isser. But that means that all along the underlying koach hamisave itself isn't inherently fundamentally bad, fundamentally evil. So koach hamisave has the capacity to switch, to be switched, minakatza lakatza, and to desire and love the good things, the real things. This also ties in a little bit to what we discussed a few recordings ago about this idea of a person's physical bodily desire, and whether that has anything to do with desiring God. So in these types of discussions, it sort of strongly imply that it's the same capacity for love. They're the Marash and the Tzemach Tzedek cited Shechem, that Shechem is the source, the model. His desire is the model and the source for desiring Hashem, that the things are very strongly correlated. So once you accept that premise, you see it in many places. So here as well, that instead of channeling that desire towards the bad things, you could completely flip it around, and it's the same capacity for desire, but it's doing it towards the Eibishter. And the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, "Be'emes the koach hamisave in the nefesh habahamis, even the part that desires, mitzad atzmoi shorshoi v'yisudasoi, it's the kedusha al yain of the pnei shor, like we said. But through the whole process, going through the madregas and falling in Shiras HaKelim. So there's the possibility that there should be a koach mis'ava l'dvar avera. But when a person returns to Hashem, you can turn one's heart from one extreme to the other. The koach mis'ava, the same koach mis'ava that was involved in a tayvara, can now return to Avos Hashem just like its source in the Pnei Shor. Whereas the Maisera, so this is where the distinction is helpful. So what we're saying is that the koach mis'ava is good, whereas the Maisera, the bad thing that one desired, that is be'emes ra gomer mitzad atzmei. That is taka inherently bad, inherently evil. So that can never become part of kedusha, and that has no takana. And that's we use language of it has to be bottled and destroyed and removed. So again, that's why this distinction is helpful. We can use this framework of chaymer and tzura to say that the chaymer, the koach mis'ava mitzad etzmat musa is good, whereas the object of its desire, that is taka ra gomer. So that helps us distinguish. So back to the mashal of Serefas HaPara. So that's the union of Serefas HaPara. So you burn the para, you burn all the external tzura, and you burn it down to just its core, its etzem. So in this case, that means you reduce it to afer, to just the etzem midas of the nefesh habahamis, just that koach mis'ava, the capacity for desire. That's the chaymer parsha that can remain. Whereas the tzura, the levushim tzayim, the soiled garments that the koach was wearing, was dressed in, those have to be completely burned in this model. They're completely destroyed, and therefore the koach mis'ava will never be dressed in them again. Not b'machshava, not to think about it, and not to talk about it, and kol shkein not b'maisa. So that in this model, in this formula, in this framework, so that means a complete break from applying the koach mis'ava to these things. And liyas oitzem edom reis berat, Pasha close one's eyes. Today we have all kinds of campaigns, vayimoin, and this and that. So focusing on number one is to not look at the bad. So that's mentioned here. Liyas oitzem edom reis berat v'chadayma. 2, 4, and here he introduces the term that's more famous, ikafya, iskafya, to force the Ja'ach to do the opposite and against what the Nefesh Bahamas desires by default. And all the choshim, re'iyah, shmiyah, and machshav dibra ma'isa. So that's where iskafya fits in, and that's the term. But here, there's a much richer framework to sort of explain what we mean when we say iskafya. So this is skafia. What you're doing is you're being mevatel those kalim. We used that framework before. You're being mevatel the kalim that the ratzin is embedded in. That's the skaf. You're forcing it. You're getting rid of those kalim and to push them away. So that is equivalent to serefas HaPara. You have to burn those kalim, the extra gimel yisaidis that were blended into it. They completely disappear through the serefa, and all you have is the atzmas, the afer. I'm repeating myself. I'm saying if it feels a little repetitious, I'm translating pretty much line for line, word for word here in Likutei Torah. I'm just not reading the Hebrew and translating because that would add to the time. But I'm going. If you followed along inside, you would see that I'm reading it pretty straight. So again, just as in the mashal, you burn off the other three yesodis that were blended in, and then they disappear through the sefer, and all you have is the atzmas, the efer. So same here, when you get rid of the levushim tzayim and machshav ibn ma'isa of the iser of nefesh habahamis, all you have left is the koach mis'ava nefesh habahamis, the way it is about tzmusay, and not murkav and melubash in the machshav ibn ma'isa of the iser. So that's the efer. So then what you have left after that, then you can take that koach mis'ava and turn them in a katza l'katza from an avara to avas Hashem, v'hafta b'chol v'chol b'shnei yitzarecha, the yitzahara, karos l'v Hashem. But so this is the process. When we talk about iskafir, we talk about turning around the nefesh habahamis. This is the process in greater detail, more vivid, more technical detail. So that's how that's pretty much ad kan the inyan in ois beis of this maimer in the Likutei Torah. Interestingly, as is often the case, this is a maimer from Tovkuf Samachei, and in the set of Amor Adam and Azaken, we have also the Hanacha, the way the Mittel Rebbe wrote it down, and often the way the Mittel Rebbe wrote it down is different. And we sort of assuming that the Maril wrote it one way, and the Tzemach Tzedek printed it that way, because sometimes the Tzemach Tzedek could have changed things around as well, but assuming that the way it's printed in the Likutei Torah is presumably the Maril, and Mittel Rebbe wrote it differently, we can sort of assume that if there are differences, the Mittler Rebbe may be the one who is already injecting, even in the Hanacha, he's sort of injecting his Havana and his own frameworks sometimes. So the Seder there is actually a bit different. I didn't spend the time to go through it paragraph by paragraph, but the format there is that the etzem framework of the mashal of the Sreifa and the Yisraelis is mentioned earlier, but the Taich and Avodas Hashem is a few oisios later. So that itself is interesting. But like I said, I didn't get to the bottom of the framework. I don't know how many listeners would be majorly interested and excited about that. But if you look in Tov Samachei Chelik Beis page, what I have written down here is page 677. So when the Mittler Rebbe gets back around to the Sreifa in the Nefesh Bahamas, so there is a bit more. It's a bit more spelled out, I think. So I did want to repeat that portion of it and how the Mittler Rebbe says it. So this is how the Mittler Rebbe specifically did a framework of calling the taivas kalim. The Mittler Rebbe says, when we see a person zchuyos and misave desires a taivim and a taivas that exist in the world. So behachrech, he says the taiva itself is ruchnis. It's an abstract thing, right? You can't pinpoint where does the desire exist. What is desire? I guess we can speak about it philosophically. Not that I consider myself a big philosopher, but the taiva itself is an abstract thing. So how does the taiva leave the realm of abstract and become more concrete? It has to be interacting with, bouncing off some actual object of desire. So within that framework, so that object of desire is the keli, the kli kibul. But here he sort of fleshes out the idea. This is the receptacle that the taiva can be received in and dwell in. Because otherwise, without that, where's the taiva going to land? Where's it going to dwell? How is it going to be mispashet? How will it be revealed? If it has nothing to connect to, then it's going to completely vanish and disappear, right? You can't picture a taiva to nothing. Even if a person feels the beginnings of some kind of taiva to something, but if there's no way to express, no way to identify what the taiva is for, then what are you desiring? Lo yiyeh shum kiyum klal afilu rega. It won't exist even for a moment. So it needs something to latch onto. And he says, gives more vivid example. Whether it's a food the person's craving or a picture. I don't know if he means that they're craving the picture or the picture conveys the object that they're craving. But when there's something for it to attach itself to, then the taiva can do its thing. So this is all to prove that we're used to the terms of and kalim, and often in the gashmis we use the person's body. So we'll say, let's say the brain is the kli, and then there's the seichel in the brain, and for the same goes for the rest of the body. Whatever animates every part of the body, whatever function that works when a person is alive is, so wherever that function is, there's the in the kli. That's more familiar. That's more standard. So we're arguing here, also more mechudesh, not such a common term framework, that every taiva's interaction with the object of desire is also the yachas of to a kli. Zok the Mittler Rebbe. So therefore, it follows that if the taiva needs the object in order for it to exist, so if we had a way of eliminating the object of desire, so if we eliminate the object of desire, then the desire itself would cease to exist. And as it's Sishtal, he quotes from Pirkei Avos, maybe it's Taka this week's parak, I have to check again, that in Pirkei Avos it says, maybe it was last week's, that the Ava, Tluya B'davar, Batal Davar, B'tela Ava. So the Mishnah itself essentially expresses this, that if you love something for a particular reason, so if that reason disappears, then the love disappears. So that fits into this idea that there needs to be, in this case, the point is that the object needs to exist. If there is no object to love, to desire, then you can't desire. So the Mittler Rebbe and his Anacha of the Alter Rebbe, so that's the Sreifas Nefesh Bahamis, that desires and it's the desires themselves are abstract. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to eliminate the kalim, the objects of the avos, and that would have to be through hechrich ukfiyah. That's what like the terminology of iskafia fits in. How will you do it? How are you going to do it? So so number one, whatever you want to do, don't do it. Using the term, let's say to not look at bad. So if the part of the problem is looking at it, so if a person forces himself to stop looking at it, so then all you have left is the desire without the object. So if you don't have the object anymore, in this case, simply parsha gashmi, this person closed one's eyes, stopped looking at the thing, so then the thing doesn't exist in their world anymore, so then the desire will also exist. If you're trying to fight the desire and you're looking at it, so the desire is latching on to the thing. If you you sever the connection between the desire and the object of the desire, so then I like the way the Rebbe is sort of fleshing it out, spelling it out in stronger terms. So that's like the Efer of the Sreifa Sapara. In the Rebbe's presentation, the terminology of Efer and Sreifa is less pronounced, and bigger emphasis on this framework of the Kalim. So that would be like the Efer of Sreifa Sapara, where it's chaymer without the tzura, and then once you just have the chaymer without the tzura, then you can turn it takim l'katza to be included in kedusha, because the is separated from the kli. There's no foreign desire, just Hashem. And that's the skafi sutya achra, and this hapcha. After this skafi, kamoshe, kasev, kamoshe nesbor, b'kutei amorim, and actually here directly references Tanya, but that's what it means. That's pshat in Tanya when Tanya talks about it. Pshat is you have to mevatel the kli and the lavush of the ava. So that's a skafia, where just forcing, compelling the nefesh Bahamas is enough. Dayoy, genug, that you should shiyase shaloi k'retzonu chikasei. Iskaf just means doing the opposite of what you want. Tzermira, asay toiv, tefillah, talmud Torah, tzedakah, to do it even if you don't want to, which ties into actually what we were talking about earlier about Kabbalah oil. So there is this nakuda that you got to do it on chachmas, on shabbos, you got to do it Kabbalah oil. But the reason why you have to do it is because right now you don't want to do it. So right now you don't want to do it, so the only eitzah is to do it b'achrich. But if you do that correctly, what's supposed to happen next is then all you have left is the raw, pure chuk and ava, and there's nothing else to connect with, to dwell in. So it's chayim b'lei tzura, and then you can reach the step of ishapcha. So this fits nicely into the model of iskafia and ishapcha. So that's how the Rebbe presents this part, which I thought, reason why I went there and I repeated it is I thought he repeats it in a geschmacka oifen. And after the Alter Rebbe said on this occasion, we do find the Tzemach Tzedek in a few places in his Torah, the Marash, the Rashab, even the Fidik Rebbe somewhere, the Rebbe. I saw Maimer Parshas Para, Tavshin Yud Ches, the Rebbe Chazard, this Teichen of the Sreifa and the Koach and other places. It's not, like I said, it's not, I can't tell if it's famous, but it's definitely not one of those things where you find it only in 5 places. Sometimes I find things that I find interesting, and I find them it's 5 places in Gans Chassidus. It's a bit more than that here. And in some places, if you're looking, some places they use the word tzur instead of tzura. So often they'll say that the koach, that nefesh Bahamas, the koach hamas ava has a tzur ra. So, like I said, there are certainly elements here that are pretty famous. So the Nakuda, the general Nakuda is pretty famous. Chassidus Chabad, that the Avodah is to transform the Nefesh Bahamas, to channel the Nefesh Bahamas. Nefesh Bahamas has unique capabilities, and if you can harness it, that's great. That is certainly fairly well known. But it does seem like the way it's explained here is in a very special, unique way. And perhaps we could actually say that if one were to want to learn this Inyan, maybe this is taka the main place, because often what we find is Chassidus repeats certain ideas very often, and if you see it 100 times, so you already have that familiarity, you come from, yeah, that's the famous, but maybe there's only one place, though, where there's actually a full page, 2 pages, 5, 10 pages, explaining it in greater depth and greater detail. And part of my project or projects is to try to identify these types of places. Often the one place where it's explained Arichas tends to also be more expressive, more evocative, more geschmack. So this is, I could say, a project that I sort of informally consider myself to be on, and every week, whether it's Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe, or wherever I'm looking at, I look for texts that seem to have this nature. Maybe this is Taka, the main place, and I'll mention shortly that there's actually a Sikha of the Rebbe somewhere where this topic came up, and the Rebbe said, "Oh, it's a sugya, and it's the sugya of this maimer. This is the makar. This is the place where this sugya is discussed about being mevayer the ra b'chlal, what it means to be mevayer ra." So, just to recap, there are two major central ideas here that I think are unique and interesting. Number one is this chomer tzura model. So, which, like I said, it helps, gives a clearer distinction. It can help distinguish between what we're saying is bad and what we're not saying is bad. And surely for anyone who struggles with their own desires or traits and inclinations, so that itself could be an encouragement and chizuk for someone like that, where you realize, wait a second, I'm not bad, or even my capacity for desire is not inherently bad. It's just the shape, the expression that it's assuming that it's taking. The problem is just the tzura. And so that already, as we'll get to, the second point is about the kalim terminology. But even without the kalim terminology, this chomer tzura model is a fairly helpful framework. So you always say, the problem is not the etzem zach. The etzem zach is good. The problem is the tzura. And this is a term, a framework that can be used in all kinds of ways. Today, obviously, it's very popular to focus on self-help, coaching, and often chassidishe itself is sort of taken in that direction and channeled in that direction. Obviously, I try to remain cognizant that that's not the main point of chassidishe. Chassidishe is about the likos, connecting with God, and it's no substitute for that, and it would be wrong to de-emphasize that. But it's interesting that the Rebbe himself, in this letter that we started with, also sort of used it in a bit of a borrowed sense. The Rebbe's lashon was gamal kegoin da koyam avur. Right, so we're not talking about a nefesh habahamis. We're talking about getting along with a rav. And the Rebbe is saying that we can apply this model in a borrowed sense. Even if you feel like you're not getting along with a Rav, wait a second, is this Rav a bad person? Or is there just something about the tzura of the Rav, the way it all comes together, that you're rubbing each other the wrong way, you're not on the same wavelength, whatever it is. But if you look past the tzura, you have to look at the koach shabbat tzura. So we're not talking about the koach hamas ave over here. But you can use this terminology of koach versus tzura to say, wait a second, okay? Tzura taka maybe doesn't fit so nicely. But if you think about the koach in the tzura and how to utilize that, so that's a very helpful distinction that one could use. So, yeah, it seems like it could be very, very helpful. The point is that there are a lot of ideas, just like in the English language, lamashal, there are certain words that only those who are bucky in the dictionary know the word. And there are certain words that everyone knows, and sometimes certain words that were obscure until a few years ago suddenly get elevated and platformed, and people say, oh wow, it's a great word, we should use it, or we should use it in new ways. So, like I said, I don't know how famous this is, but to whatever degree it is or isn't famous, I think this is worthy of sort of being platformed and turning it into terminology that we use and invoke more often, because it does seem like a very helpful thing to apply. It's certainly, take for example, in the educational system, there are many kids, if you want to talk about people's self-perception and looking at it a bit from that angle, there are people who grow up and they feel like as children they were treated as bad kids, or even now kids in the system and the school are being treated as bad kids. In some of the cases, not all obviously, but in some of the cases, we see stories where dafka some of the personality traits the child possessed that people were trying to quash and squelch, it could be dafka those traits turned out to be what helped them succeed in life. Right? So that sort of demonstrates that the underlying thing could be a good thing, and maybe it was being misdiagnosed by treating the underlying chomer as ra. You did an avla to the child, and adrab, he needed to. That's his personality, and he was able to channel it, and even prove to the world that this is actually what helped them succeed. Again, not always. are there people that still need to figure out how to channel their traits. But we certainly don't, certainly have cases, and maybe I have noticed, and in Chabad in particular, maybe it is sometimes noticed and called out. There are certain cases where there are people that, okay, this guy is, he's a little meshuggah, he's a little wild. We use these terminology, and Chabad will say also this guy is toyudik, different terms that people will use. But they'll say, you know what, this guy, Taka, is a little wild, but he uses his wildkeit for miftzayim. He does, he's makar of people, and he's not embarrassed, he's not ashamed, a shameless person in a good way. So this is observed. There certainly are contexts where this observation is made, but kedai to use this as a broader framework that certainly does apply to many things in many cases. You can always ask yourself, are we talking about the chaymer? Are we talking about the koach? Or are we talking about the tzura? Are we talking about the tzir? Just like the Rebbe invoked it here in the context of this Rav. So that's one major point that I think is taka very geschmack and very kendait, which is what the Rebbe was referring to, which is how I got into this. But also the second point, which the Rebbe in particular was marchev on, this idea of, in the context specifically of taivas, of thinking of it as the capacity for desire versus an object, and that if there is no object, then there's no real way for the taiva to exist, and the two frameworks are connected because we're saying the kalim correspond to the concept of tzura. So the chaymer is the koach misav is the chaymer, but it only attains a tzura when it connects to these kalim. So this idea, this framework, and saying that, so you have to focus on being mevatel the kalim. You don't have to be mevatel the desire. Right? Maybe people feel they have to fight their desire. You're not fighting your desire the way the Rebbe is saying. You have to fight the object of your desire, which, like I said, does fit with these campaigns we're seeing lately. I can't speak to their success, but it seems like many people do feel that it's successful, it's matzliach. So you sort of do have to target the ability to find these objects of desire. Interestingly, there are other places, Rebbe, we know, was Isaac in these inyanim elsewhere. In particular, what comes to mind is Pekeach Ivrim, which is a kuntres the Rebbe wrote, ostensibly for Bali Tshuva, but Bali Tshuva in the old sense, someone who's a Bal Aveda who now wants to be Chayzer B'Tshuva on his Avedas. And the Rebbe is very strict, and big portion of his instructions there are about how to avoid, I believe the word is recidivism, unless I'm confusing the letters, in which case that's embarrassing. But the Rebbe is saying about Tshuva, they have patterns of behavior, they fall into certain traps, and he goes through in great detail. It's just when you read it, it sounds very very strict, very harsh. But if you're going for that, to be a real Baal Tshuva, so Rebbe is very clear. You have to, here's a list of things, very grob, gret, begashmias, these are all the things you have to avoid. You can't run into these things that are triggers for one's koach hamasava. So this certainly connects to that. So these are the two interesting points, the chaymer tzura and also the koach hamasava versus the kalim. Other points in chassidus behamshich to this, connect to this. I already mentioned that the etzem description of burning an afer is in Tanya, Ikeres HaKodesh Siman Tazvav, in a different context. Another interesting source that I saw is that in the Hamshich V'Kacha, the Marash, Tafish Lamed Zayin, and the Maimer for Koirach, interestingly, he phrases it as a question, because you also have this raid in Chassidus Chabad, very famous in Bas Lagani, about shtos. And there's this language of you have to take the shtos. And what's shtos? So we talk about kisis te'ishtoi, so we're talking about real ra, seemingly. Then we talk about you have to take the shtos and turn it into kedusha. So interestingly, the Marash expresses there that this seems to be bestira to the raid from Parshas Chukas, that you have to burn the tzir, and only the chaymer remains, and the chaymer can be nishapach l'toiv. And there was language we had earlier, that the way the Alter Rebbe said it was, is that the chaymer isn't inherently bad, but the other stuff is inherently bad. Whatever is inherently bad has no takana, it only needs bittul. So, what's pshat to be mahapech l'shtos kedusha? What the teretz is, you have to be ma'ayin there in the whole mimer to see how he answers it, and what the definition taka is. But it's interesting to observe that this is ba'atzem Ibn Ufik seems to be a stira to the famous talk about mahapech l'shtos. Another interesting marker that I alluded to earlier, the Rebbe, is the Sikh of Shabbos Achrei Shabbos Hagadol Tavshim Daled. The Rebbe had printed the Sikha that year, it's just now in the Sikhas, where the Rebbe made the point about zedonos, nasik, zchuyos, the averos turn into mitzvahs. That it's not just there's different ways of defining it or describing it, but there the Rebbe went fully ahead and said that it's mamish the cheftza of the zedonos. So mamish sounds like you're saying that mamish the avera, right? So a person had a list of bad things that they did, and that cheftza turns into a zchuyos. So it's like the avera became a mitzvah. So it's almost like the bad thing you did now counts as a mitzvah, which is a bit of sounds a bit shocking, a bit extreme, whatever term you want to use. And the Taka at that time in the Mems, the Rebbe had instituted the system that people could ask kashas on the Rebbe in the Koiftzim, the Koiftzim Aris, Alitaira, Maristam, and the Rebbe would often respond. So I didn't go look it up to see who asked, but it was the Aris of Alitaira. And in the Alitaira, there's a sefer, Alitaira printed a number of years ago, a sefer with their malakit, all the places where the Rebbe responded to the Kovetz Ha'aris of Alitaira. So they bring the original Sikha and they'll bring the Ha'ara that the person printed. I didn't go look it up on this occasion because it's only B'derech Agav. But someone asked in the Ha'aris that L'chayr in Chassidus it says that the Ra cannot be mishapach. He quoted from elsewhere, not from these Mekayros. So how's the Rebbe saying that the Cheftza of this zedonos becomes zchuyos? So the Rebbe answered, the Rebbe said, and often the Rebbe would sort of push back a bit, smack the Ha'ara writers down a bit. The Rebbe said, when it comes to this inyan, it's the sugya shleim, it's the ganze sugya. This is the sugya of this maimer, this chukas. This is the place to look. And Bashteta, the Rebbe quoted Barichas, this idea that this is the koach ava, the sreifa, the efer, the choyme, the tzura. The Rebbe said, so when I said that the chefs of the zedonos becomes toiv, so, and you asked either that can't be mishapich, so this mimer is the place where the distinction is given. What does this mimer say? There's a distinction between the ra itself, which is taka ra and has no takana, versus the koach ava, which b'shas maisa is also ra, or even ra gomer, but inherently atzmusa is not ra. So when I said that the chefs of the zedonos become zchuyos, I didn't mean the aver itself. That's, I guess, taka chas v'shalom to say, but when I said the cheftza, I meant the choymer of the ra that could be nis'ala, and that could be nishapach from zedonos to zchuyos. That was essentially how the Rebbe explained it. But the Rebbe laid it out arichis and broke it down, and so you see there's three components to every avera, and sort of repeated it very barachava dika geshmak and dika oifen. And the Rebbe actually brings a tzushtel. The Rebbe brings an example. There's perhaps a famous Gemara in Menachos about the power of tzitzis. It says that there was a person who heard that there's a woman of what's one of the euphemisms in English? Woman of the night. I don't know the euphemism so well. But Kitzer in the Krake Hayam, far off somewhere, and he went all the way, and she charges a large amount. She's like the top of this tchum, and he desired it. He went there, but he had the tzitzis, and then right b'shas ma'isa, the tzitzis tafchulei alpanov, and he sat down, and then she was all offended. It's the first time someone didn't go ahead, and she couldn't understand, so she asked him, and he told her it's the tzitzis and the schar of the tzitzis, and so she sold everything, and she divided her money, but she also brought her mattresses. It describes how she had the silver and the gold, she had a whole elaborate setup there. The term that's used are the matzois. You have to climb the 7 matzois to get there, whatever the description is. So she liquidated everything, and she gave some of her money away. She kept some of the money, but she kept the matzois, and she came all the way to. She asked him when he shared this teaching with her. She asked him, "Where did you learn this?" And so he wrote that. He gave her a zettel of his rabbi's beis medrash, and he went back home, and she took the time to liquidate. And she also showed up at the beis medrash. And she wanted to be Megayer. So the Gemara says, they asked her, do you have a particular person in mind? Like, that's often a strike against someone who wants to be Megayer if you just want to marry someone. But she gave them the zettel, she showed them the background, the context, and it's not spelled out very clearly, but it seems like they took it to mean that, if those are the circumstances, and that he inspired you in this way to be Megayer, so then it's not a problem. It's implied that she wanted to Taka come and live with him now, Beheter. That would maybe psychologically one could say because she was rejected, so she Dafka had wanted him, which goes into this tchum of psychology of, I guess, in today's Megushim Dika world, is the idea of men not acting so excited and being negative and negging, and that, but that would be a psychological reading of it. But Al Kapanim, the Ruchnistik reading of it is that she was Taka inspired by this, and she part of it was that she wanted to be with him. So it's not fully spelled out, but it sort of jumps. It says they asked her, she showed the tzettel, and then it says, so those, whatever the exact translation would be, but those matzois, the things one would lie on to be together. So originally she had laid them out for him be'isr, so now she could be matzia loy beheter. So she was able to sort of recreate the scenario with those matzois, recreate the picture, but now she was Megayer, and now she's exclusive with him. So now it was beheter. This is how the story ends in the Gemara. So the Rebbe doesn't bring the whole story. The Rebbe just quotes the line. The Rebbe says, oh, this is a good example in Nigla. The Rebbe always like to connect chassidishe and Nigla. So the Rebbe says, applying that standard, that model, so there's something transformed there. There's zedonos not like koach, something transformed. But what transformed? The matzav of be'isr can't transform. Whatever is aser is still aser. That can't transform. But you could take the same matzois that represented the utter isser, the pinnacle of isser, and with the complete and correct transformation, that could still turn into a heter. So that would be seemingly be the example where, in this case, I guess the matzois are a form of chaymer, and what you do with it, how you use it, that's already the tzura. So there's the part of the ra gomer that cannot be nis'ala, it can't be ma'iled, but there's enough there are enough ingredients there that potentially, which are sort of part of the picture, but are the chaymer, that are not inherently bad, they're just being used in the wrong way, that can be transformed to be used in the right way. And in this scenario, the final picture of them being together is pretty similar to the original picture of them being together be'isr, but enough has changed that it's beheter. So that's a place where that was the sichu achrei tafshim dalet. So very interesting, very geschmack, and like a yisoid in the sugya. Like the Rebbe says, this is the makar, this is a sugya shleima, this is the makar. I did not find that the Rebbe used this nakuda elsewhere, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So it will be interesting to look. But like I said, we started with this letter where the Rebbe invoked it in the context of this Rav. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I actually found that we do have the complete letter of the Rebbe with more information, and it was printed in a tadpis of Sefer Toldos Berel Baumgarten, printed back in Tafshin Samach Beis. So there it turns out this was a letter to the Berel Baumgarten, who was shliach in Argentina, Buenos Aires. And there it says Harav Zayin Gimel. So there it doesn't, instead of a da, it says Harav Zayin Gimel Shichya. Now, now I'm thinking about it, I don't know 100% if the Rebbe actually wrote Zayin Gimel, or maybe in the original the Rebbe wrote the name, and maybe even in their uncensored, they still wanted to be Makatza, I don't know. But seeing Zayin Gimel was enough for me to be able to figure out who it's referring to, because it was a notable Rav whose initials were Zayin Gimel in Argentina, and in fact there are letters to him in Ignis as well that have had a connection with him in Ignis. Now that I have it in front of me, I'm not sure if I should say it out loud. Maybe still not so nice to say it out loud, but obviously I have the name, and this is someone, you can Google the name, you can find references to it in Hebrew and to English. It's described that he came there and he was like the spiritual father of hundreds or thousands of Dafka, the Sephardic youth, maybe from Syria, from Turkey, wherever they came from, they ended up in Argentina. And he came, and he had a very strong personality of Kir, he was Makar. So there's like a huge community. Today there's a community there called Shuva Yisrael. You could find their website, you could find the leaders, and they consider themselves to be a hemshech of this Reb Zayin Gimel. Like I said, you could find other sources about him. Found online on one of the Israeli Kiruv websites, they describe a whole story that he came to an important meeting with some important minister. I don't even have the story in front of me, but he wanted something, he wasn't going to get what he wanted, then he put on his hat, he made a bracha shahako, and then somehow that influenced the minister to give him what he wanted. Episode Interessante Mice is on the Dirshu website. I just have the title of the article in front of me, not the story itself. So there's the stories about him. I'm giving hints. Anyone who wants to try, it shouldn't be too hard to figure it out. So I don't know exactly what was going on there, but I guess Rebbe Baumgarten was doing his thing, and this Rav was doing his thing, and it seems like they got along broadly, but maybe not befratius. They had differences. The Rebbe is telling him, don't focus on the differences, because usually someone from Chabad, someone not from Chabad, automatically there's a different tzura or a different tzura. You're not gonna see eye to eye and everything, but focus on being menatzel the koach sheba tzura. For the Haggis of chassidus, or even limud of chassidus. What's interesting is that the next paragraph, if we had spent less time until now, maybe I would focus on it a bit more, but now I'll just mention it a b'kitzer. The next paragraph is that the one thing that should be fixed, so Rebbe is saying, you don't have to fix him, you just have to learn to get along with him. One thing that needs to be fixed is, you write that this Rav asar b'meshach kol hashavua, v'hitir rak b'leil Shabbos kodesh. What are we referring to? We're referring to the inyan of kedusha, prishos, of how often husband and wife should be together. And there's a mahalach, which used to be more common, and today it's probably much less common. A mahalach that b'chalal during the week it's not appropriate, it's not accepted. It's only b'leil Shabbos kodesh. So a komtois lapi kabbalah, whatever. So he had written to the Rebbe that Yaner at gehalten azoi halacha l'maisa. That was how he instructed his talmidim, his mekoravim. The Rebbe says it seems from your letter that he assured it, but pierced with a taikev, mamish the starkite, which I guess fits with that story on the Dirshu website. That it seems like he had his inyanim, that he was very stark and betaikev, like a personality, a character. It sounds like. So he answered this mamish with a starkheit. So the Rebbe says versteht sich that this concerns whether this is a good idea, what results this could have. B'deirenu dor yasim. It's not a dor that's built for this type of level of kedusha. And if you don't see that you'll be able to change his mind, maybe I should write to him myself from here. And then in the regular igris it says ... And in that tatpis, there's the other half of the paragraph is, but the Rebbe says, we have to, if I'm just going to reach out to him out of the blue, it's going to look funny, or it's going to look like you wrote to me and I'm writing to you, so you have to figure out if that can work, if that's appropriate. So it's interesting to see these interactions. So it's not clear to me what exactly the parsha was. Maybe Rebbe Baumgarten's mishpacha have more information. Maybe if they did a full biography, maybe it would be clear. I don't know. It's not clear if the two paragraphs are directly connected or they are just sort of related to each other. But it's interesting. We know that the Rebbe touched on this in a few places, and I touched on the topic of Kedusha Prishus before, the big shir that we did b'shaitoi in the Koilel. That was maybe, I don't know if that was the shir with the most views, b'shaitoi, but that was one of the subcategories, one of the topics covered there in the Rebbe in Shloch Menachem. It's Malukot in Shloch Menachem. The Rebbe, on a number of occasions, expressed that we can't make that the default anymore to say only Leil Shabbos Kodesh or only once a week. And there are other places. There's a sefer Habayis that also is Malakit some of this stuff. I'll mention here, I don't know how many people are going to get to the end, but the point I was actually thinking that really would be kedai to make a likot of everything chassidus, not just everything that Rebbe said. That l'chayda is more or less malukot. These like sort of practical heiras, but just like in that shir and more recently, different than Yonim Chassidus, relating both to the negative and to the positive. In my opinion, it could be a full likot and it's stafka from Mitler Rebbe, Tzaltzeg, Marash, things that most people will never get to. They'll never find it. They'll never come across it. People don't even know that Chassidus has a lot to say on this topic. I just saw there's a sefer Kedusha Utznius from Daniel Frisch, the Makobel, who kocht in the minyan. He made a likot. He's malakit from all kinds of chassidishe svarim, and he divides it into chapters. But I didn't see a single marker from Chabad there, and I think Chabad in its own right could contribute a similar sefer. It could just be Makaris Chabad, something I would be very eager, happy to do. We're just looking for a misgaras, for funding, etc. That would be something I would certainly be interested in doing. So I'll mention it here. Why not? So it ties into this. So anyway, so it's interesting that the turn the letter takes from the more the general point to this more specific point very interessant, and it'll be interesting to know what the Battle Bimgerton's relationship was with this Rav, and what this Rav exactly was like. Sounds like he was an interesting person. The type, maybe more than your average Lubavitcher versus non-Lubavitcher, could be Taka in his personality. He was even more like the type where you have to say, look, some of the tzura, some of the packaging is a little interesting, but you have to look under the packaging. But I don't know. I didn't see that there were any biographies or detailed descriptions of him, but maybe you have to keep looking. Cholefen, that's the contribution from the chassidishe parsha of this week. And there's a dogma of what I think could be very helpful, very useful for the Olam if we knew that, everyone knew that in the Torah this week, check out Ois Beis, it's a fundamental Inyan, so at least people could make the most of their Torah learning, and then if there was a list of the 7 Geshmak Inyanim in the Torah this week, so then on Sunday you could learn that Inyan with the Arum around it, and then on Monday the next thing. So that's how it all ties together. And I hope this enriches both your weekly learning of chassidishe parsha, and like I said, I think this is a very useful and helpful framework bichlal.